Hello, and welcome to the third installment of The Future with FullCycle. FullCycle is a private equity fund that invests in companies and their related infrastructure projects that have a material effect on the stabilization of climate. Today's topic is California's climate leadership, and I'm delighted and honored to introduce our special guest, Kate Gordon. Welcome, Kate.
Hi, it's great to be here, Rachel. Thanks.
Kate Gordon is the director of Governor Gavin Newsom's Office of Planning and Research, and she's also the senior climate advisor to the governor. Kate has a long history of working across diverse stakeholders on complex challenges to find pragmatic and innovative solutions to the climate crisis. Prior to her role as OPR director, Kate was the founding director of the Risky Business Project, which focused on quantifying the economic impacts of climate change on US energy demand, crop yields, and coastal infrastructure, as well as human health and mortality. This work has served as a foundation for several other initiatives, including the Climate Impact Lab and 427, a science-driven risk analytics solution. Prior to her work on Risky Business Project, Kate served in senior leadership positions at several nonpartisan think tanks, including the Henry Paulson Institute, the Center for the Next Generation, Center for American Progress, and as a non-resident fellow at the Center of Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming Kate Gordon to our program today.
Thanks so much, Rachel. It's great to be here. Hi, everybody.
To begin our program, it's important that we recognize the reality of where we are right now in the midst of a global pandemic. In addition to the human suffering that we are experiencing from the current COVID crisis, the impact of our economy here in California has been catastrophic and sudden. As the governor said, in just 6 weeks, California went from a $6 billion budget surplus to a $54 billion structural deficit. How are our state officials responding to this crisis, Kate?
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind. I mean, I know for everybody on this call, for me personally, for all of you personally and professionally, this has been, a crazy, crazy time. And for the state in particular, as Rachel just said, we really, in an unprecedentedly short amount of time, went from a very ambitious January proposed budget with a lot of new programs, a lot of new, kind of innovative ideas about how to expand our work in various key areas, including climate, to, really having to scale back quite a lot in the May revision of the budget. Our Department of Finance has projected this $54 billion deficit. Also, they're projecting, and I think it's important in terms of how we're thinking about priorities, they're projecting as high as an 18% unemployment rate in the state for at least the next several months. Currently, we're at about a 24% unemployment rate, which is 3 times the Great Recession unemployment rate. Just to be clear, we've got over 4.2 million unemployment claims out. We've spent $12 billion already on unemployment claims. So it's just really a stark situation that's caused by a combination of an enormous amount of spending on the COVID crisis for health, for hospitals, for emergency services, for safety net programs, and then of course a real hit to our revenue side in terms of sales tax, property tax, and capital gains and income. So it's a very, very tough time. I will say that in the May revision, and I'm really proud to work for a governor who has prioritized those safety net programs. What we're trying to do with the May revision is to keep whole our programs like CalWorks, which is essentially our temporary assistance for needy families program at the state level, our Medi-Cal program for low-income individuals for healthcare, our other core programs for things like homeless individuals, so that we can make sure that people who are already disproportionately affected by the crisis aren't even more harmed by cuts. Keeping those programs whole, as well as prioritizing basic government functions around health and education, means hits to the rest of the budget. And we really are looking at pretty big declines across the rest of the budget. In the climate space, we are continuing to prioritize work in vulnerable communities, in particular around air quality and water quality, and continuing to prioritize, of course, fire safety and fire preparedness. But these are tough times. There's no question, and there's definitely some things that were in the January budget that are just not possible to go forward in the same way we had originally intended.
Thank you for your leadership. I can't imagine what this must be like. You mentioned vulnerable communities, so I wanted to touch on Assembly Bill 617, which is specifically designed to address some of those issues you talked about, pollution and negative health outcomes in some of our most vulnerable communities. Given the recent data, there was a Harvard study and there are a number of other studies that proved that many of these communities have a disproportionate burden when it comes to the COVID-19 health outcomes. Could you speak more to your thoughts about that and how we're approaching that response?
Yeah, there's a relationship between our climate agenda and COVID actually in a number of places. Health is a big one. So as you know, folks with impaired lung function are in general very vulnerable to the COVID virus, and are also disproportionately getting it, disproportionately getting into ICUs and getting really ill. There is, of course, a huge relationship between air quality and underlying lung conditions. Asthma rates in some parts of our state that have particularly bad air quality are a real source of some of the numbers that you've probably seen in terms of disproportionate sort of racial impacts across racial categories, across income categories. So we're looking very hard at that. We've got a couple areas of the state that are in non-attainment from a federal air quality standpoint, particularly down in sort of the Inland Empire and lower San Joaquin Valley. That's the result of actually a kind of a perfect storm of things. It's both that there is a huge amount of truck traffic that goes through those parts of the state. When folks come in, when cargo comes into the LA and Long Beach ports, it then goes up the 5 generally to the rest of California. And the 5 is, of course, runs straight through the middle of the state. Combine that truck traffic and all of those emissions with the geography of the middle of our state, which traps that smog and pollution in those areas. So we have actually a lot of truck traffic in the Bay Area, for instance, but we have these winds from the ocean that pull it out into the ocean, and so we don't have as much of that kind of trapped particulate matter, and that's a real issue. 617 was a bill that was passed really to make that connection between climate impacts and health impacts, and to say we need to do a better job monitoring air quality in these areas. So what that program does is put a lot of air monitors in place, and it also says we need to do a better job engaging with these communities on solutions to these issues. I am really happy to say 617 is still a priority program in the May revision of the budget. Just for a tiny digression, because not everybody is as steeped as I'm unfortunately having to be in the weeds of how we fund our climate programs. But let me just say for a couple minutes, the climate programs are primarily funded through our proceeds from our cap and trade program. So we have the auctions 4 times a year. Those auctions generate revenues as polluting industries buy permits, essentially, from non-polluting industries. And there's that whole trading system that basically the revenues from which go into a pot at the state that the Air Resources Board manages, and that the legislature directs to particular programs. That is a separate pot of money from the rest of the budget. So it's, again, it is not general fund funded. It is not funded from special fees or taxes. It's funded entirely from the cap and trade auctions. That's good and bad in the current situation. The good part is that it's segregated, and so it's not, you can't take from it to pay for other things in the budget. So that's a good thing. The challenge is that we are expecting auction proceeds to be much lower in the coming year because of things that are good, actually. I mean, the program was not set up as a revenue generator. The program was set up to reduce emissions. Yeah. Like the gas tax, like other taxes, the more you reduce the thing that you're taxing, the less taxes you have, right? The more you reduce emissions, the less money you have. So we're in this interesting situation with COVID where a lot of industries that are heavy emitters are actually shut way down or slowed down, and they're emitting much less than they were, which means that we're expecting proceeds to be much lower. At the auction, I'm not actually sure what the results were of the auction 2 days ago. We're waiting to see those results, but in these next 4, we're expecting to be lower, which means the entire greenhouse gas reduction fund amount will likely be lower. So what we've done in the governor's proposed budget is to say, look, we're expecting lower numbers. We need to prioritize. And what we've done is we've said, we're going to first go with our continuously appropriated programs that take 1% off the top of all the auction revenues. Those are really key transit programs, including a lot of transit electrification, the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities program, which combines affordable housing and sustainable strategies for key projects around the state. Those are all, and safe drinking water, are all continuous programs. But then below that, we've said we're then going to make 4 priority areas whole before we go to any other discretionary funding. 617 is one of those areas. And I'm going into detail just because I think it's important to know that even in the kind of segregated cap and trade budget, the governor's really prioritized these impacts on vulnerable communities in particular through 4 priority programs. 617 is one of them. Safe drinking water, so additional funding for implement the safe drinking water programs is one of them. Fire safety and fire protection is one of them. And then the last one is, I can't believe I'm not going to remember the last one. Wow. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, it's another air quality program. Thank you. It's the agriculture diesel program for ag vehicles to change out their engines. So both the ag diesel program and 617 are disproportionately important in terms of that question you asked about air quality, particularly in the Central Valley. So long answer, but I think it's important to give that context.
Actually, at FullCycle, we focus on short-lived climate pollutants, which are key contributors to these contaminants, and many of them, including methane, are 86 times more powerful than carbon emissions. Many people don't necessarily know that, but they have a disproportionate warming effect, and many of them are unsafe for people to breathe and have had direct links to these negative health outcomes. So thank you for the work that you're doing there.
Yep. And I should say, just because there has been a lot of confusion on this, those are the 4 priorities, but if we bring in enough from the auctions, and again, we just don't know what will happen with the auctions. It's possible that there will be an uptick in industry again. It's possible that some of the stimulus money will be put into industry. We just don't know. So if there's enough money coming in from the auctions to fully fund those priority areas under the governor's budget, then the other discretionary programs that are in the January budget would be funded. And manure management is one of those, which also goes to your methane point.
Excellent. Yes, I was going to ask you about anaerobic digestion, so we'll get to that momentarily. I know a lot of people who are in the call will have questions, so all of the participants are able to ask their question by submitting it to the Q&A, and our moderator will pose those questions at the end. So we'll be reviewing them, and you'll have an opportunity to ask Kate your questions through the moderator. So I wanted to get back to, given the new reality, how is California investing in greater resilience across the board, including climate resilience at this moment in time?
Yeah, resilience is a really big priority of this administration. And my role, I should say, at the Office of Planning and Research, not everybody knows what that is. And so just a little background, we are a governor level office. We're in the governor's office. We provide support and advice to the governor and to the cabinet on a variety of issues, primarily in long range planning around land use. And in that category falls kind of intersectional issues of housing, transportation, land conservation, and climate resilience, of course, as well. We also are home to the only statutorily created program on climate resilience in the state, which is the Integrated Climate and Adaptation Program, ICARP, which is a research program that also has a technical advisory committee that works directly with local and regional governments and stakeholders on climate resilience issues as they affect different regions of the state, which is important because, as you all know on the call, climate impacts are very diverse, and they're varied across the state, and different regions have very, very, very different priority climate resilience issues. We're continuing with the ICARP work. ICARP just put out an annual report, actually, which I would recommend to folks. You can find it from the OPR website from our climate resilience tab. We also play at OPR a role that I think is important to talk about, which is an interagency coordination role. And that's where a lot of climate resilience work happens. It's not an issue that's only about, Cali PA, or only about our resources, natural resources, or it touches everything. It touches transportation, it touches built environment, it touches housing, it touches every part of our water infrastructure. So we use iCarp, and then we play this role to sort of bring all these pieces together. And one way we're continuing to do that is to follow up on an executive order that the governor signed last fall, Executive Order 1919, which calls for us within state government to think of ourselves, and this will be resonant to many of you on the call. We are major asset owners and investors ourselves. The state government is itself kind of a key and large investor. We put billions into our pension funds, obviously, as investors, but we also own or invest in the whole transportation system. Our Department of General Services has 19 million square feet of office space or other buildings that we manage or own. We lease even more than that. We have a 51,000 fleet, vehicle fleet at the state. Like, we have a lot of things. And so what the governor said in this executive order was essentially, as asset owners and investors, we need to be thinking about climate and aligning with our climate priorities when we make those investments and when we're thinking about those assets, acquiring, designing, leasing. We have a whole interagency group that's run through my office that's looking at particularly implementing that through our transportation system and our Department of General Services. We're also working very closely with our pension funds, which are of course independent, to leverage the great work CalPERS and CalSTRS have already done and the UC retirement system have already done on bringing down emissions and doing sustainable investment, and also working through with them kind of best in class ideas that are out there around physical climate risk and disclosure. So we're doing a lot of work in that space, very operational, but to me, that's where most of the climate resilience work is most important, is in that kind of operational decision making. How do you mainstream the idea of resilience into decision making at the state level? And the last thing I'll say on that is that this is obviously a priority of this administration, given that week one of Governor Newsom's first term, this term, was the PG&E bankruptcy, which is like a perfect storm of all these things, right? I mean, you have a climate risk, physical impact intersecting with one of our a state regulated utility that's a huge utility, intersecting with the ratings agencies downgrading everybody because of those risks. And I point to that because I think it's actually really important to know that PG&E, who has been a partner of ours on sustainability efforts forever, of course, but PG&E was rated extremely highly from an ESG perspective in 2018. In August 2018, they put out an annual report with a whole page of awards that they'd gotten on their ESG ratings, none of which incorporated an analysis of climate resilience to their physical assets. And I actually just think that's important because we can't do that anymore. We are not in that place anymore. I mean, Larry Fink has said climate risk is investment risk. We've seen it play out at a state level from a fiscal perspective. We cannot ignore the risks we're taking and the potential for future emergency services and emergency response spending of these assets. And so we're really serious about this particular issue.
Yeah, well, it's well said. And this relates in part to what the work you are doing with the Risky Business Project.
It does. Yeah, it does. And I've been really proud to be able to bring in some of that work and some of those insights into this work. And, I am also, I will say, just incredibly proud that the underlying research of Risky Business, which was done by the Rhodium Group and was open source as part of our contract with them for Risky Business, is also the work that BlackRock is relying on for its asset level analysis of physical risk. So there's a lot of overlaps and intersections, but, it's been kind of a crusade of mine personally for the last, 5 years to mainstream this stuff into infrastructure investment and decision making, because it just is ultimately, it falls on us at the state level to clean up if something isn't resilient, right? And to try to make people whole and to try to deal with the outcome. And it's just not a smart thing for us fiscally to ignore that.
Well, at FullCycle, we agree. As a managing director, we are very aware that climate risk will affect every portfolio. And to turn that on its head, we believe that investing in decarbonizing the economy is the greatest investment opportunity of our lifetime. And now is the moment, first, because there's not enough investment capital flowing into the sector. So we hope to prove a model that will attract additional private capital, but also structure public-private partnerships in a way that can allow for multiplicity of positive outcomes. And I'd like to understand your thoughts about public-private partnerships and what you think, again, in this new reality, the opportunity is.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one of the things that we're very focused on because of the budget situation is alternative models of capitalization of many of our ideas, right? There are areas we will not be able to fund with general funds at the levels we would have wanted to, but we also know, as you do, that there is a lot of private capital out there looking to be deployed into smart opportunities that do frankly reduce either the physical risk or transition risk from climate. So there's smart decarbonization opportunities, there's smart resilience opportunities. I know you know, Rachel, that and many on the call know that in the January budget, we were proposing a very significant new fund, which we're calling the Climate Catalyst Fund, that would have put $1 billion over 3 years into low interest loans, loan guarantees, and other mechanisms for the government to de-risk some of these projects that are out there in the pipeline that are, for whatever reason, being seen as risky by traditional capital markets. We were really looking hard at the transportation sector, at circular economy areas, which I know you pay a lot of attention to, and at agriculture and forestry in particular. That program is not going to be able at this point in the current governor's proposal. And again, I should say, we are in negotiations with the legislature. So ultimately the legislature makes the law. We put out a proposal. We're in a lot of conversation. In the May revision from the governor, the Climate Catalyst Fund was not funded with the general fund. That was just not something we could justify given the current budget situation. On the other hand, it is really significant that it's mentioned in the summary of the budget, because the governor himself personally has made the point to us in the administration that this is a priority and that it's incredibly important for us to be looking at alternative ways to capitalize this program, whether that's through a kind of the federal kind of infrastructure bank, green bank conversation, whether it's through some kind of combination of capital stack from the private side. We don't know. We're looking for opportunities, and we're very engaged at GoBiz, our Business and Economic Development Department, and the iBank in particular is engaging in this constantly to figure this out because it is a priority still for the governor and for us. And we do see, we've identified over 700 projects in a potential pipeline. So we know that's out there. We know this is out there to happen in many cases. It does not replace the need for grants in many cases. We're just looking at ways that we can actually add additional, to your point, additional support in places where the government can play that critical role in partnership with the private sector.
So for those of you on the call who have ideas about how we might partner, Kate's all ears.
I am. It's a big priority for me, that fund. I think it's, I was lucky enough to work at the Center for American Progress during the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act era and post ARA, and worked a lot with the Department of Energy's loan guarantee program and also ARPA-E and other programs at DOE that were looking at innovative models of public-private partnership. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here and a lot of great models out there, including green banks in Connecticut and New York. And just, there's a lot to learn and a lot to build on. And I frankly think in California, we have more private capital than most states. I mean, it's actually kind of amazing to me that we don't already have this kind of mechanism. So we're really focused on it.
Back in February, you mentioned the launch of a program called Regions Rise Together, which was a way to connect state government to the disparate parts of our state. And we are quite diverse and we have varying needs. I noticed that one of the pillars of the program was around economic inclusion and climate resiliency at the center of economic development efforts across the state. Yep. Given everything that's happened, is this program still in operation? And if so, how has it been transformed in order to accommodate the current needs?
Yeah, Regions Rise, for good or bad, was never actually really a funded program of the state. It always was a frame or a lens through which we were looking at a lot of our other work. And so it continues to be that. The fundamental theory behind Regions Rise was the governor, actually came out of a governor's speech, the governor making the point that we as a state have a real inequality between the coasts and the inland regions. And that inequality isn't just income or access to jobs or unemployment levels. It's also the amount of private capital that flows from philanthropy and from the private sector that flows into the inland California is very, very low. I think it's like a 50th of the money from philanthropy goes in inland compared to what goes to the coast. So it's really striking. So we started, Lenny Mendoza, formerly at GoBiz, and I started thinking about this from an operational perspective and thinking, we need to kind of get out that message and be educating, kind of what we say, changing the mental map of California, so that we don't just think about LA and the Bay Area, but it actually is a mental map that includes the sheer amount of support that the coasts get from inland. I mean, most of the resources of the state actually flow from the inland to the coasts. Right? Whether you're thinking about water, whether you think about food, oil and gas. I mean, all of these things actually are coming from inland. Sorry, my son is now practicing piano behind me, so I have a musical accompaniment. This is our current lives. Many of those resources flow inland, and we don't necessarily pay attention to that, and then we're not seeing the support go the other way. So we use that frame to think about a lot of things, to think about land use policy and to think about sort of doing economic and jobs growth and development inland so that people who live in the northern San Joaquin Valley actually don't have to commute over the Altamont Pass to jobs in the Bay Area, for instance. We can lower vehicle miles traveled. We can lower emissions through making smart land use choices. We have 80,000 people a day right now, or before COVID, that came over that path to jobs in the Bay Area, right? I mean, it's amazing. How do we think about offices, private sector, second offices locating inland instead of locating in Nevada or Colorado? How can we think about these places that are real sources of growth? Bakersfield is the fastest growing city in California right now, and Sacramento is the second fastest. These are not coastal cities. So how do we kind of capitalize on that? So we're still looking at that as a model. We're briefing the governor's jobs and recovery task force on Regions Rise. We're thinking about the regional model as we think through recovery. The different regions of the state are very disproportionately affected by COVID. So because of regions have different industries that make up the bulk of the region, as you guys know. So we have places like Santa Monica is a great example. Santa Monica's city budget is down by 40%. Because Santa Monica is disproportionately dependent on restaurants and hospitality and industries that are very, very hard hit. So we need to be looking at that and paying attention to recovery and how it's happening in different places and doing different, as we're doing, county level guidance at different levels. And we're really trying to think that through from an economic perspective as well. But it continues to be a major focus for the administration.
In a recent NASA survey, 30 landfills are responsible for 40% of point source emissions of methane. And one of our portfolio companies, Sonova, is transforming waste, especially plastic waste, into high value feedstock for industrial processing. Given methane's disproportionate effect, how is the state of California thinking about reducing methane emissions, and what are some of the projects underway that you think are effective and that you're likely to be scaling when possible?
Yeah, that's a great question, and at a level of granularity that I cannot answer because that is really a Air Resources Board question more than anybody, and CalRecycle probably too. I will say that the programs that I pay the most attention to, which have been the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund programs, obviously manure management, anaerobic digestion has been a big part of our conversation about methane and continues to be. We're also in general, as administration, and I think it's clear from the Climate Catalyst Fund areas, we're very focused on circular economy in general. So where can we think about waste streams that can be repurposed into products, into new or sequestered, or just all these questions around sort of how do you build more of a circular economy so that we're being smarter, because we do have a lot of emissions, carbon and non-carbon in the state. And even though we've done incredibly well in terms of our leadership on climate change and climate policy, our emissions are still pre-COVID basically flat. which is, it's a win because we have a growing economy and a growing population, but it's still not going down. It's essentially flat. So agriculture is an area where we are particularly focused on, and land, on changing that. I will say that CARB is going into a whole process on integrating natural and working lands into the scoping plan that's just starting now. And I think there'll be a lot of opportunity for stakeholder engagement and a lot of opportunity to think through what that looks like and how that's operationalized.
You mentioned anaerobic digestion, and I know that the low carbon fuel standard has done a lot to unlock new investment opportunities in anaerobic digestion in other areas because they're now able to qualify for high value credits for their renewable and natural gas. At FullCycle, we're also very excited about the opportunities to invest in anaerobic digestion. So I'll come back to you later about that.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, the LCFS is like just such a critical part of our climate agenda. It's, for those who don't know its origins, which people probably do, but when we talk about our cap and trade program or AB 32, we tend to just talk about the cap and trade program, but actually AB 32 passed under Governor Schwarzenegger was cap and trade plus our renewable portfolio standard plus the low carbon fuel standard. And there are many people out in the analytical world who believe the LCFS is the most valuable of those three. It's had a huge impact on emissions in the state, and has been copied by several other states. It's a very effective program. So it's getting things into LCFS is always a good way to move them. We see that with CCS. Yeah. I mean, carbon capture and storage is in there now, and that's been really interesting to watch that new addition, and that the inclusion of it as something with value has really changed that market. So.
And this is, again, a model where California's leadership should serve as a template of sorts for the rest of the country and some of our federal programs. So let's hope that the LCFS has that sort of impact. I wanted to ask you a bit about California, which essentially is a nation state in many ways, as the governor has recently stated. How is California working with other governments in order to meet our commitments in the Paris Agreement?
We have a number of initiatives with other governments. I mean, we do a lot of informal, just technical advisory work in general. I mean, particularly CARB and the California Energy Commission and the PUC. All of our regulatory agencies in this space do a lot of advisory work, but we're formally part of, and we actually co-chair the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is an alliance of 24 states and Puerto Rico that are working together around aligned goals for our climate future. That's really important because together we make up like 60% of the national economy. So it's a big chunk, and it is bipartisan. We have a couple of Republican governors on that. We also co-chair the Pacific Coast Collaborative, which is us, Oregon, Washington, BC, so British Columbia, are part of that, and we do a lot of work there for the coastal issues. So for instance, ocean acidification is a big issue of the PCC. And then at the international level, we are one of the leaders, and we were one of the founders before my time of the Under 2 Coalition. So that's a coalition of subnational jurisdictions, whether regions, whether states, whether provinces in some countries. Over 200 subnational jurisdictions that are working together on climate. That's really important in the international context because even though California is the 5th largest economy in the world, if we were a country, we have no seat at the table at the UN conferences on climate change because we're not a national government. So Under 2 provides an arena to have a much stronger voice across the international process. So all of these places are really important areas for us to not just lead, but also learn. There are other states for instance, that are stronger than we are on some of these issues. I know that's hard for Californians to hear, but we don't actually lead on every single one of these issues. Many of them we do, but not all of them. Like natural and working lands, for instance, we learn a lot from the other states. And frankly, also things like, managing, there's a group of states in the U.S. Climate Alliance that are oil producing states, and how do we work with, how are we all managing that at the same time we're managing our climate priorities? So it's a super interesting coalition and really, really helpful as we're thinking through our policies. But I also think has a lot of impact, frankly, especially in this very strange time of, just a withdrawal at the national level for many of these processes. We, I think, have a lot of power in terms of our market size and our influence, and being able to kind of bring that to the table has been really important.
Mm-hmm. I should note here that FullCycle is a signatory to the United Nations ambition pledge to
Great.
5 degrees Celsius. And then we also are a signatory to the IFC principles of operating impact management.
Great. Well, and that's been so important. I mean, the fact that both subnationals and business play, I think the Paris Agreement would not have passed if there hadn't been a subnational and business engagement kind of pushing underneath the national level, because it's that kind of political pressure, frankly, that changes the national conversation. It was incredibly important. I think everyone is struggling with the question of the role of subnationals in the private sector post-Paris Agreement. But what we've obviously seen here and everywhere is that nobody is meeting their commitments. So we're going to have to figure out, I think, new models for both private sector and subnational engagement. And that's a topic of a lot of discussion in the UK, who is hosting the next meeting, whenever it is, whenever that actually happens, who knows, is very focused on that question as well.
I want to switch to a question about what California residents can do to be part of the solution around addressing the climate crisis.
I mean, so many things, right? Like climate change is, I think everybody on this call probably knows better than most people. It's not just an environmental issue, right? I mean, it's an issue that affects every sector and every industry in every region. And it's ultimately, I usually say, when I talk about this in like speeches or whatever, I usually say that it's a macroeconomic issue like globalization and automation. It's something that it is part of every decision and every kind of investment and it needs to be part of everybody's thinking on everything. So there's no one answer to what people can do individually. Some of it is the same thing that I would say if you ask what companies can do. I mean, honestly, some of it is like make smart decisions when you're doing capital stock turnover. If your hot water heater breaks, like invest in a better one that's more efficient. If you are looking for, if you're leasing a vehicle and your lease is up, look at an EV. Like just make the decisions that are smart in your own life, and also, frankly, as investors, in your life as investors, because you personally have a lot of influence on a lot of things that are not your own personal household decisions. Mm-hmm. The other thing in California, though, that I'll say that I think is not always top of mind for people, but it is really important, is, transportation is 41% of our emissions in California. Transportation is disproportionately a big deal in California. And the reason for that is twofold. We have 26 million cars. We have a lot of cars. Mm-hmm. But we also drive a lot. We drive more than most people, right? And CARB the Area Sensitive Board has said in a report they put out in December 2018, they said, if we want to meet our transportation emission goals in this state, if we want to come close to meeting our goals, which are actually, law. So if we want to come close to that, we have to not only 10x our electric vehicle fleet, but we have to reduce our vehicle miles traveled by 25%.
Wow.
Across the state. The biggest answer to how we do that, the single biggest answer, and the thing you all can do is to build more housing. It's the single biggest thing we need to do. If we have more affordable housing in areas that are close to jobs and services, we will lower VMT. We will lower VMT. Telework will help. And I think there's a huge revolution going on in telework, and that's really interesting. And those of you who own companies, those of you who manage, consider requiring it, like Facebook just did. Consider requiring it a day a week or 2 days a week for those who can do it. That will have a big impact on driving, and it has already done that. But also, honestly, go to your city council and your board of supervisors meetings and support housing development, because opposing housing in California is essentially guaranteeing emissions at this point, given our land use patterns. So I'm just very, very bullish on that, because I think people don't think about it, but it's really important.
As a native Los Angeles resident, I was shocked when I read the Morgan Stanley Cars and Climate Report that said that Los Angeles averages 107 billion car miles traveled.
Yeah,
It,
it's
it's
insane.
staggering.
And
And I,
it's partly, it's partly a we've had 70 years of a land use pattern based on a highway system.
Mhm.
California, most of our population growth happened after the federal highway system was built, which is really unusual. I mean, most other states didn't have that kind of population explosion in
Mhm.
the 50s and beyond, right? So we had this terrible perfect storm of sort of highway driven land use development, highway driven and then cheap construction driven land use development. So our land use patterns are really, really dispersed and sprawly. And, there's a reason we have 11 million people living in high fire risk areas of the state. And that's in large part because people have been driven out of population centers because of expense. So it isn't just about building, it's about building close to stuff. And I'm not saying just build on the coast. I'm saying, let's build inland in those fast growing cities. Let's do the work to do it, economic development, jobs and transportation kind of approach that really centralizes or kind of builds what we call it OPR 20-minute communities. Everybody in California, all the polling, everyone wants to live in walkable communities. Everyone. It's just that a lot of people can't afford to.
Yeah.
So how do we change that dynamic? And I think that's just critically important. It really kind of is the difference between us and a lot of other places at this point.
So now is a great opportunity for us to transition to questions from the audience.
Perfect.
And as a reminder, if you would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. I'll move over to question 1. As wildfire season picks up, we know its impact on air quality across the state.
Yeah.
What can California's response be as it coincides with this global pandemic?
Yeah, fire season. I was actually just on a call this morning. We have daily, including the weekends, daily calls, which are called Unified Coordination Group calls, which bring together our Office of Emergency Services with all of the cabinet secretaries, with just all of the response work going on across the state. And this morning we were on the call, and our Office of Emergency Services is, of course, doing a huge amount of work on COVID, but they're also the people who have to deal with fire. So they were reminding us that we have not had enough rain this year. We've got, I think last I checked, 23% of the state was in drought conditions already. Yeah, I know. And we're looking at a fire season again. And so we've done a lot as an administration, as I think folks know. Over the last couple of years, we've put an enormous amount of financial support and personnel into forest management activities in particular, but also fire detection, LIDAR, I mean, a number of things. Because we got to reduce the risk, right? I mean, again, as I said, 11 million people live in these areas. They're not going to not live in these areas. So we need to figure out how to do home hardening, how to do community hardening, how to do forest management. All of that is really, really important. It's very much complicated by the current crisis in a lot of ways we wouldn't necessarily think about. So fire, we rely on folks in prisons to do a lot of our fire safety. We actually but we deploy prisoners. And we did during 2018, a lot of the folks on the fire crews. And can't really do that because, as you're probably following, the prisons are just hotbeds of COVID, and there's a lot of positive cases there. So you can't really do that. We are having a really hard time with in-person fire training for fire safety crews because we can't have that many people together in one place. Firefighters are used to living together when they're deployed in close proximity, going out and fighting together and then going home, and none of that works in the current stay-at-home environment. Yeah, I know it's really hard. And then, of course, emergency shelters, right? I mean, you think about what happens when there is a fire and people get displaced from their homes. Where do they go? They go to like the school gym and everyone's sleeping on the floor, and you can't do that either. So we're really thinking through all these aspects. How do we've put in place some really innovative online fire training. We're trying to slowly bring back fire training as an essential service. The crews are coming up with all kinds of strategies of like sleeping outside in tents and all kinds of stuff to make this work. And we're also obviously continuing to do a huge amount of work with the utilities through the PUC to really push them on their own safety protocol. And they've been doing, months and months and months of going out and checking lines. And I mean, we're kind of doing everything we can, but the reality is, you guys know this, you work on climate issues, these are going to be more frequent and more severe. And again, we already have a lot of people in these areas. We're not going to that's not going to change. So what are the options? What are the creative solutions on that side? To be safer is a big set of questions. I know. It's really hard to think about. It's really hard to think about.
So of our next question, in addition to affordable housing, how can the state incentivize alternative transportation, public transit, and bicycle use to be a factor in reducing our car miles traveled?
Yeah, I mean, those are a huge part of the conversation. I think sometimes we in California focus a little too much of our attention on like personal electric vehicles as the solution to everything, when you're absolutely right. First of all, those are not available to a lot of people. You'd be surprised at how few people buy new cars actually in California. It's a very small percentage of car sales. Most of them are used. And there are increasingly EVs on the used car market, but that's only just starting to happen really as leases end. And we're starting to see things like the Chevy Bolt and stuff go into the market. So I'll say on the car side, just because I'm talking about cars, I am a real big proponent of the kind of program we do have in the state, the vehicle retirement and replacement programs that really focus on the used car market. I think anything we can do to think creatively about the used car market is really important, and to get folks into those cars. That's a really successful program. On the transit side, luckily, transit is one of the recipients on the continuous appropriations for Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. That's really important because those transit programs are already, as I said earlier, we're already working through Department of Transportation to make sure that those are sustainable investments and that we're prioritizing electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles and other options. Transit has become tricky, like everything else during COVID, because people don't want to ride it. And we're very, very worried about that. There's evidence from other countries where there's much higher transit use in general, like Italy, that people are abandoning transit and going back to personal vehicles because of the crisis. So how do we rethink transit as a result? If we want people to socially distance on buses on major trunk lines, which are the major bus routes, like I'm trying to think of where, for those of you in San Francisco, I bet some of you are from San Francisco, the Geary Boulevard buses are major trunk line buses. They run all the time. A lot of people take them. You're gonna have to run more of them because you have fewer people on each bus. So you're gonna have to be running 2 buses for every 1 bus today, or 3 for every 1. That means buses have to be deployed from other places that have less frequent service. And so the question is, what do you replace those with? And people are thinking through some creative stuff, like on-demand van pools as a better option. There's a lot of very interesting conversation about actually incorporating e-bikes into transit systems, so that instead of being kind of a disconnected other service that has different card, a different pay system, a different whatever, we actually try to integrate those things. So we're like, okay, let's consider the e-bike a part of your transportation, service. And there's a lot of thought that, especially with cities closing down streets, right, that e-bikes are like there's a whole new era going on here for e-bikes and scooters as part of a transportation system. So I think that stuff is interesting. I think we actually do have to be really creative about this space because it is likely to change dramatically. At the same time, the state is, of course, continuing to prioritize things like electrifying Caltrain, which is really, really important. So, we're looking at all kinds of different things, but transit is absolutely a core part of the conversation.
Another area that you mentioned was really important and is of great interest to our audience is around affordable housing. So can you tell us more about specific opportunities for public-private partnership in building climate positive housing to meet both affordable housing goals and carbon reduction goals?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Like, we are, as you know, the governor quoting McKinsey has been really clear that what we need are 3.5 million new units in the state if we're going to meet our housing goals under our population projections. That's a lot of new units. we need to make sure at least some percent of those are affordable, and affordable means different things to different people. So that's a whole discussion. We also need to, so when I say a percent are affordable, I mean, they all need to be affordable to somebody, but we need to make sure that there's a certain number of them that are really designated for especially lower income folks and working folks. We also, as I've been saying, and I just will keep saying, because it's sort of my mantra, we need to make sure we're not just throwing them wherever, there happens to be a bunch of land. Like if we do 3.5 million units through greenfield master plan community development, it will not be a win for the state frankly, from either a climate perspective or an affordability perspective. If you combine housing costs plus transportation costs, then those become unaffordable. We've seen this all over the state. If you're 45 minutes away from a population center, which actually takes you almost 2 hours to get to because of traffic, that transportation cost is significant in your household budget, because of wear and tear in your car, because of having to buy an extra car for everyone in the house, because all these things, that actually negates the whole affordability of housing. So we need to look at affordable as meaning housing plus transportation. That's really, really important. There's a lot of opportunities. This is something that the governors continue to prioritize. We did not cut a lot of our housing programs in the May revision because housing is so critical to everything we're talking about. One of the really important ones, I think, is the infill infrastructure grant program, where the state essentially supports through grants local governments to build the underlying infrastructure for infill housing, so that cost is no longer part of the development project, and it makes it much cheaper. I would love to explore some interesting ideas around public-private partnerships here. I think one of the biggest challenges in housing development in California, it's the financing, which is important. And I've heard in multiple meetings with the American Planning Association that in California, it's about $100,000 a unit extra to build. That's the delta between all the existing programs and the cost, because of a lot of things, but primarily because of project delay. That's a stack of things. It's land costs, it's labor costs, it's materials costs, it's a whole bunch of things. But permitting delays are the big one. Like, that is the big one. We have governor has said this a million times, it's in the budget. We are very interested in streamlining on our side where we can to reduce those as much as possible. We don't control most of that. Local government controls most of that. Today, local government can get you out of every one of those delays by pursuing what's called by right housing, by saying, hey, if you meet these 10 criteria, you're exempt from the CEQA process. Local governments can do that. I can't do that. Sacramento, if you look at Sacramento's city council just passed a by right development plan, which is really interesting to look at, and I highly recommend. So like, at most points along the CEQA process, local government can get you out of it. Many people don't know that, but there it is. So this is why I keep hammering on the go to your city council meetings, because ultimately those decisions are made locally. We have a lot of local control in this state, and we are very, very, very interested in that housing development. So we're supportive.
Our next question: California has been recognized as a leader in climate legislation. Do you think it's likely that Congress will take similar action on climate that California has, or do you believe that these necessary sustainability measures will continue to be led at the local level by cities and states like California?
Well, that's a very political question, but it's a good one. It's such a hard question to answer. I think that, well, let me take a step back for a second. I gotta think about how to answer this. First of all, I think that California has been a leader, and I think we have been a model, particularly for goal setting. But even more important are the programs that we have that are actual implementation programs. So again, Cap and Trade is an implementation program. It actually sets priorities that have funding associated with them, right? That like create costs or savings. So it's fundamental. Yeah, exactly. It's fundamental to how people do planning and how they do investment, right? So same with LCFS, same with renewable fuels, same with the renewable portfolio standard and the 100% clean energy standard. Those are all business, like operational business things that people now have to integrate. The goals themselves don't do that. So I do always want to separate out sort of like, we have a goal in California of carbon neutrality by 2045, which is great. And it shows a lot of leadership. It is not actually an implementation program, right? We have a goal of 5 million EVs. It is not actually an implementation program. Getting from goal to implementation is Governor Newsom's #1 priority. And that's where we have to get. Where we have to get with Congress as well is getting this stuff baked in to decision making and not just out there as like sign-on letters and theoretical ideas and like talking points. And that's really, really hard because the talking points get you a lot of press and a lot of shiny objects. And they're like, they get you on stage at the COPs, at like the UN climate meetings, like they're great. Sign-on letters are great, like big goals are great. I'm really interested, and this is where I do see the potential to move in Congress because it's bipartisan. I'm really interested in things like, can we attach, climate risk analysis to infrastructure investment
Exactly.
at the federal level, right? Can we think about, especially now when we're thinking about stimulus, can we think about every single state has climate impacts that are decimating their state budgets? Everyone is worrying about FEMA putting less and less money into the state emergency response efforts because FEMA has less money than they have had because there's so many disasters, right? Everyone's worried about this everywhere. So whether it's the Florida delegation that's freaking out about sea level rise, whether it's the Wyoming delegation that's freaking out about snowpack, whether, whoever it is, I think we have a real opportunity to get resilience as a bipartisan issue into planning at the federal level. And I think that is the kind of thing we need to be focusing on because it's possible, it's less political, and it has if done, that would make enormous difference to how we spend federal money.
And we have a tremendous opportunity right now because we are investing and infrastructure will be key. We have an opportunity to right size a lot of these programs in a way that builds greater resiliency, particularly around climate and potentially green jobs. And
it's true. We have a great opportunity. I think the tricky thing is that when you go from the reason Risky Business did, which was very bipartisan, was structured the way it was around physical risk, because physical risk is easier. When you get to what we call transition risk, which is like, what is the risk of it's the stranded assets conversation. It's the like, what's the risk of the transition? That is a lot harder because by definition, you're making a case that there are entire industries that will be going away and that you need to replace them. And the reality of the federal government is that entire states' economies are based on those industries. So that's why this is so political. I don't actually buy that it's climate denial. I've had hundreds of conversations with Republicans in Congress. I do not buy climate denial. I think it's that. It's the fear. It's the fear of the bottom falling out of your entire economy. And I get that. I mean, that's not crazy. So we really have to be thoughtful about what that transition looks like and have, as you said earlier, the opportunity side and the solution side has to be not only a talking point, but like a real fundamental implementation strategy in order for us to get past that.
Well, we're now at 2 minutes, so I think now is a good time to close out. Thank you to everyone who submitted your questions. We had many questions submitted. I'm sorry
I tend to be long-winded in my answers. I apologize. Next time I come back, I'll be shorter, and then I'll get more questions.
There's pent-up interest. So on behalf of all of us at FullCycle, thank you so much, Kate, for taking the time, especially during this critical period in the state government, and for your leadership in the governor's office. It really helps knowing that we have a climate visionary and pragmatist at the helm of such an important role. And we want to thank you also for your enduring commitment throughout your career to addressing climate change, and while doing so to support the most vulnerable among us.
Thank you, Rachel. And I just want to say to everybody on the call, thank you. Every single thing about climate change relies on the private sector. There is this much we can do in the government in terms of setting policy and making things consistent and setting expectations, but most of the implementation falls on all of you and the companies you work with. So thank you for everything you guys are doing as well.
Wonderful. Well, we appreciate everyone joining. Thank you for your questions. And please join us for our next Future with FullCycle. And this will be a recorded event. So if you've registered, you will receive a link to the recording. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Be safe and happy Memorial Day weekend. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, everybody.